Welcome to Missing Persons Uncovered. I'm Karen Shalev-Green, and I carry out research into missing persons at the University of Portsmouth in the UK. In this podcast, we seek to understand the complexities of a global issue. Every year, millions of people go missing worldwide.
I'm Caroline Humer, a child protection expert, and across this series, Karen and I are talking to professionals to share insights into how we can all be more aware and take action to protect vulnerable people in our communities and families from going missing.
In this episode, Caroline talks to Hubert Humphrey Fellow Leticia Risco. She is from Argentina and has led the implementation of a national missing persons response in Argentina and has strengthened cross-country collaboration across South America.
I think that the most important thing in cases of missing persons is that the agencies have to work together. I'm sure that if we do, we'll have more chances of success. And for those who work with missing persons, that we know that we have our obstacles, that we have our lack of resources sometimes, and we have to our daily fight against the bureaucracy. But please, you have to think that behind each folder, a family is waiting for the relatives, and that it can happen to any of us. Thanks for having me. I admire the work you and Karen are doing with this podcast. It's an honor to participate. Thanks for joining this Latin American voice. I am Leticia Risco, lawyer by profession. Since 2011, I have the honor of leading the team who designed, implemented, and managed the federal system for missing persons in the Ministry of Security of Argentina. I'm currently a Hubert Humphrey Fellow. It's a Fulbright program in the University of Minnesota.
So with your experience, Leti, in Argentina, and I think I can also say you have experience broadly for South America as well. We want to talk about abductions. Give us an understanding of your experience around abduction in Argentina.
I've been collaborating with police officers and prosecutors for more than a decade. We had several cases in these years of abductions, and that there are several types of abductions, and mostly of them were parental abduction. That is the most common type. I think that if we have to ask for a general definition, we can say that an abduction is every illegitimate deprivation of liberty of a person, and it has to be against he or she will. I think
it has to be against their will, absolutely. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where the interpretation then becomes there are differences between disappearance and kidnapping, forced disappearance. There are many different types of abductions, and they happen in every country. But I think that the interpretation of what an abduction is differs in some countries. So what kind of different types of abductions are there?
I think there is three types of abductions. You have the kidnapping by a stranger. That is often the most feared type of the abduction in most societies. But there is also the family abduction, and there are also the forced disappearances, that there are illegal detentions. And the United Nations, in the Convention Against the Forced Disappearances, gave a definition that consists in the arrest, detention, kidnapping, or any other form of deprivation of liberty carried out by state agents or by persons or groups of persons acting with authorization, support, or acquiescence of the state, followed by the refusal to recognize such deprivation or liberty or concealment of the fate or whereabouts of the disappeared person, removing him or her from the protection of the law. That's the definition that the International Convention for the Protection for All Persons from Enforced Disappearance gave to us, signed in 2010.
What I find fascinating is the definition around abduction, because the first time I came to Argentina, it was forced abductions from the dictatorship time in the 1970s. At the time, we didn't talk about what the abductions are today, because it was still very much of abductions are when it was the dictatorship. And when we talk to countries in Europe, to North America, abduction is more considered as stranger abduction. And so there is a disconnect, I think, within society of what we mean by abduction.
It was between 1976 to 1983. There were more than 30,000 people who were disappeared, murdered, and killed by the army in that period. And we have a tradition to trying to find those disappearance people. And now we have the challenge of work with missing persons in democracy. We were talking about the different abductions and the different challenges that the abduction has. And you have to, forced disappearances in Argentina is called when a police officer or some agency of the state is involved in this disappearance. You're supposed to have the trust in the police in your country, and if the police is involved, I suppose this agency has to protect the community and is now the author of disappearance. Besides the moral or the ethical problem that it means, you have to deal with the manage of the evidence, trying to discover, or they could destroy the evidence, and the challenge that this forced disappearance brings, like you have immediately ordered to another force to start the investigation, because you cannot trust in investigation that the same force was doing. And we can see not only in Argentina those cases, we can see in cases like, for example, Mexico or even Colombia, with the different problems that those countries are dealing with.
Absolutely. They have the same concerns and the same difficulties. And we will, in one of our future episodes, we will talk about missing during war. So that will be talking more specifically when there is uproar in a country. So what's happening in the Ukraine, in Yemen. So we'll talk a little bit about missing in that context. I think what's interesting is that it's up to each country to really develop those individual policies and response to abductions. But that's why I think we put our information out there to help professionals to understand what this issue is and how we can deal with it. I do think the definition is an important part, because with that definition, we won't know what we actually deal with and how to respond.
Exactly. And I think it is important for a unified action in different countries, because in cases of missing persons, we say that the time is a gold. You have to act fast. If you have a different way of act in each country, and you have to work with other agency, you have to the same language, because otherwise you are wasting your time.
I think parental abductions are certainly one of the most difficult ones, because it's emotions that are involved, and then also the legal system. And so it becomes much more difficult for parents and for the police and for prosecutors to work these cases. And I guess when we talk about, as you said, you had majority of your experience has been a parental abduction. And I do think that is consistent with other countries, that when we talk about abductions, majority of them are parental abductions and not stranger abductions. And I think that's really good to know, that stranger abductions in the US is less than 1% of all missing children cases. And I think that's consistent with other countries as well.
I agree with you that they are not the majority of the cases, likely. And I think this is common according to our experience and the other colleagues in other countries. We manage the same percentage in similar percentages in different countries, no? And I think also we have a problem with gender violence, more of the missing women, more of the crimes against women. In the cases of missing women are committed, have a relation with gender violence, and sadly the extreme gender violence, as the femicide case are. For example, one of the parents has some mental problems, or if there are some kind of reports against one of them for physical abuses against children. And so imagine even more if you have parents that take the children outside the borders of your country. That's more difficult, and you have to start working with another agencies.
Most of the cases we see in the media are related to abduction, even though they are rare. Letty tries to explain why the public and the media are so interested in abduction cases.
I think there is a particular interest of media in criminal cases, and to show and acts like a parallel investigations held by the media, and that is really important for the authorities who are in charge of investigation to talk with the media, give them official information, ask them not to reveal some kind of information or some image of the procedures, because first there is a victim and there is the family that also they are victim of the situation, and besides, because maybe they are the possible damage all the investigation that is being held. So that's important to the authorities. The ideal situation is that there is one person of those agencies who talk every day with media and make them understand that first there is a victim. There is a victim, and they have to respect the family and the procedure.
I think there's a huge need to talk with media on how to handle these cases, and having a media officer alongside the investigation to be able to work with media and explain why certain information cannot be shared with the public. It's something interesting that you mentioned just now, is that abduction is the only criminal type of missing persons. All the other definitions that we use around missing persons, from runaway to lost to disappeared, is not a criminal offense in most places. Abduction is a criminal offense.
Exactly. And there is abduction, and there is also trafficking, that there is a line who separate. And I think that the police officers and prosecutor has to be aware of this, of when you start investigating a case that of a missing persons. And if you discover some different points that make you think that you are in a case of trafficking, you have to start investigate with another kind of resources, another kind of tools, international cooperation tools. And at least in my country, it's the investigation is held for different agencies. If you have a missing case, it's investigated by local authorities. If you have a trafficking case, it's investigate for federal agencies.
Most of the cases we see in the media are related to abduction, even though they are rare. Letty tries to explain why the public and the media are so interested in abduction cases.
In every case that you consider that maybe is a relation with another country, immediately the authorities has to take communication with Interpol to make yellow alert or another kind of alert, a blue alert or a black one, if you want to identify a Jane Doe or John Doe in another country. But you know that the most common, in fact, there is always an ask for collaboration with the Interpol in different cases, but the most common, we were saying before that the most common abductions are the parental abductions, and there are, when we are talking about international cases, there are also the more common situations are the parental international abductions. And there is a challenge that who are in charge of parental abductions, accordingly to the Hague Convention, are civil courts, not criminal courts, not criminal prosecutors or police investigators. And that's a challenge because they don't have the knowledge or the expertise in cases of investigating cases of missing persons. The authorities has to collaborate with these civil judges. In a case, for example, we have to participate in a case in which there was a child who were taken by her mother from a country, and arrived the mom was from Argentina, and the father was looking for the child. They start the procedure in his country for the international birth of the child, and there have been like 6 years working, and they asked for our help. And of course, when we start looking, and a month ago we were able to know where was this child and make possible to the reunion with the family. And this was because, of course, that if there is like a prosecutor or police officers have more resources, more knowledge, and more experience in cases of missing persons.
And that goes also to collaboration, because you were collaborating Interpol with the father's country, with The Hague, to be able to coordinate the reunion and the information and sharing and everything else.
And you know that it's really hard for these cases when you think the children are when a parent, the mother or father, the child is in good condition, is okay. And when the cases that we worked, the children, they lived hidden, they just go outside in night, they don't have friends because the mother or father have afraid of the authorities to find them.
I think that's the important part for the listeners to understand, that abductions are complex and long. Usually they take a long time because they're this complex between the legal system, the criminal system, potentially international system. So that's also one of the reasons why they're so complex and they take so long.
And they have also different challenges. I think that all the cases, missing cases, are complex for prosecutors or police investigators because they have to investigate all the different hypotheses that they are involved, and they have to start looking in every kind of scenario. And there are some points that they are difficult to manage the time. For example, the first hours in a missing case, and mostly if we are talking about an abduction, they can be the difference between life or death. You know that when we were working in have our Amber Alert in Argentina, that is called Alerta Sofia, we found the studies who shows that more than the 90% of the children are killed in the first 24 hours, and more than 76% they died in the first 3 hours. So when we start to working in an abduction case, you don't have time, you have to act immediately. I think one of the first thing that is we always say is you have to make immediately the report if you know that there is some missing persons. You don't have to wait the 24 or 48 hours. The first hours in a missing case are the golden hour, and you have to tell everything to the police. Maybe there are some things that you don't want to tell because you have some shame or you have fear or so on. It's important that the police investigators has all information. Maybe there is something that small or insignificant you think it is, you should talk with the investigator because it might bring light to the investigation. If there are people who are afraid of dealing with the police or the prosecutors, there always are channels that you can use for giving information in an anonymous way. And I think there are the programs for witnesses protection.
Letty gives us an example of how the Inter-American Court explains the need for immediate investigation.
In America, there is Inter-American Court that have some interesting rules in cases of missing persons. For example, the Cotton Field, it's a case in which the American cohort sentence rule against Mexico. It was a case in Mexico for 3 women, and one of them was a child. In fact, their bodies were found in a cotton field, and the 3 of these women, the teenager, were found, and the 3 women were disappeared, and the families received really harsh treatment by the authorities. And it makes sense to the judges of this Inter-American cohort says that sometimes there is some authorities, some agencies that are waiting that something is wrong to start investigation. Okay, it's been a month. We don't have any news about this person. I think maybe it happens. Something wrong happens with this person. We are starting investigation now. Yep. Imagine after a month.
It's too late. Let me ask you a little different in regards to abductions, as you've done work in these things. How did you work with the family when you had to deal with an abduction case?
My experience, when you have to work with these cases, you have the head, at least in Argentina, and I think there are several countries who works in a similar way. The head of the investigation is a prosecutor or is the police, and we always recommend to them who are in charge of the investigations that have to support mentally the family. They have to treat them as victims, because they have to understand that the victim is dealing with a really traumatic moment, and understand that it's almost impossible to ask a family who wait and stay calm in their homes when they don't know what happened with their relatives. No? And sometimes, besides the support, they have to manage the information. For example, there are several families who make posters and put their own phones in these posters, and they receive all kinds of information by these phones, and they have to, the police or the investigators and the prosecutors have to offer them a police number receive this information. I think they have to be support in all the way, in all the process of the miss, and but at the same time they have to be part of the process. They have to know what the forces, the prosecutors are doing. And sometimes that there is a common thing that we saw in all these years. There is some families who don't give all the information to the police because they are afraid of prejudice or prejudge for the authorities. I think every country has to manage with these problems of lack of gender perspective in the investigations. I think there is one of the most difficult things to manage for the family, that is you don't know what happened to the relative.
And I think that's always the difficulty of wanting to give the family closure and the answers. And of course, you can't always do that. And that's the tough part. Even here in the US, if I look at the numbers, we have about 14,000 abductions, but just above 11,000 of those are then solved by the end of the year. So there's a lot of uncertainty when it comes to cases of abductions and missing persons if you don't start immediately. And I think that's the complexity of it. And I do think with abductions, it becomes much more difficult. There's a risk that is involved. Talking about risk, how, in your experience, how have you used or using risk as a way to determine what resources you need for the investigation?
Yes, there is a different kind of risk. If you have a child of a young age, it's a possible case of Amber Alert, or that you have to act immediately because there is a really young child and disappearance, or you have an elder person with some mental problems. For example, we have several cases of also with older people who more imagine, and women in their 80s with dementia and in winter, and she left their homes with just few clothes. So you have to start looking immediately. There is also cases of gender violence. If you have a person who she was victim of gender violence, and the last time that she was seen was with the former partner who was the author of the gender violence, we already said racial discrimination. There also are some challenging points like recruitment through social media, the dangers of the technology. We have to also, there are some job offers or romantic outings, the people that the victims didn't know never before. They are predators on the prowl.
Sort of predators on the dating apps that then find vulnerable people, meet up, and then abduct them or kidnap them. We've seen that in the US, with some cases around adult persons going out for the evening and then taking an Uber home. And the Uber actually then assaults or abducts the person. It does happen. I think we all need to be careful when it comes to meeting strangers online and all of that aspect. And we will talk about that in a different episode as well.
That's the reason why it's really important to the trainings. And as you said before, it's important to train in the police officers, but also the trainings that are made by some NGOs in schools, or to give knowledge to children or young people, that they have some cases that you are going to dating with someone, you are chatting with someone in the social media. I think there are some NGOs that they're doing a really amazing job in this.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And there's some great NGOs who are doing education for the public.
With all of the complexities and public interests around abductions, Letty leaves us with a very important message.
I think that the most important thing in cases of missing persons is that the agencies have to work together. I'm sure that if we do, we'll have more chances of success. And for those who work with missing persons, that we know that we have our obstacles, that we have our lack of resources sometimes, and we have our daily fight against the bureaucracy. But please, you have to think that behind each folder, a family is waiting for the relatives, and that it can happen to any of us. And we have to help those families because it's our job. And years of hard work and effort allows that just one child to come back home. I think it will be worth it.
And that's one of the reasons why we do this podcast, is really to share that message widely.
Thanks for having me, and thanks all the audience for hearing us today.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Missing Persons Uncovered. And thank you, Letty, for sharing your original experience in South America on abductions.
If you'd like to find out more about our work and our resources we mention in the show, you can go to missingpersonsuncovered.com. And if you have any questions you would like us to answer, or thoughts on topics you would like to discuss, please contact us through our website. If you'd like specific information or need help, please reach out to your local police department or national charity. If you are enjoying this podcast and the discussions, please help support us by buying us a coffee through missingpersonsuncovered.com. I'm Caroline Humer.
And I'm Karen Shalev-Green. Thanks for listening. Join us next time when we will talk to Paul Belly about how missing person investigations can turn into homicides.